So, organizational change. So it's a very large and complex topic. We use the term organizational change or change management for pretty much everything. When we're talking about a new cultural or employee experience initiative, to the impact of new senior leadership, from mergers and amalgamations, to the changes to underlying technologies and infrastructure our organizations run on, or even adjustments to the internal processes and the procedures that we use every day. So change management affects every aspect of businesses. And this is kind of why talking about change is sometimes challenging. What the change is and how it affects people involved and what the long-term measurements of success will be is so unique to the situation. So to ensure we give you something of value in our talk today, we're going to look at the realities of traditional change management, where we typically go wrong, a better way to look at managing change, what effective change management should be, and the versatility of successful change management. Now, when we're talking about change management, we're often referring to the common understanding of organizational change. However, the way that we commonly understand and approach change management is really part of the problem. The truth is that the common methods, traditional strategies, and the way we've always done it aren't working. We need to see that how we manage change needs to evolve. Now, in 1995, John Cotter published research that revealed only 30% of change programs are successful. There were decades of businesses and organizations developing and shifting to meet the times, the technologies, and the evolution of the workforce. However, by the mid-90s, most organizational change was not considered successful, which is really shocking. However, it's not getting any better. A 2008 McKinsey and Company survey indicates that the percentage of change programs that are successful is still only 30%. 13 years after John Cotter's results, we're still not getting any better at managing change. Now think about what happened between 95 and 2008. The internet started showing up in every home and business. Google was created. Digital advertising became a thing. Social media was invented. We all got smartphones. You know, all these huge things that completely changed how we do business. All of these huge dramatic shifts in the business landscape came at us. But when organizations tried to change and incorporate them, they were still only 30% effective. Now, fast forward another 12 years, and things have barely gotten any better. We are outright failing our change management half the time, and we're only considered successful 4% more often. All of this time and effort to improve change management, and we're not getting the success that we need. I think a clear real-life example of this is how unprepared pretty much every business was for the changes brought on by COVID-19 and why everything has been so hard. How we thought of, were taught, and were expected to manage change has not been successful. But we always seem to get through it, which I think is part of the problem. It's like we can stumble and suffer through, and eventually the new change won't be new anymore, which is why some organizations are not learning from the trials and tribulations of their last big change. But if only a third of change is successful, that means that 2/3 of change are still happening, but they're taking way longer than they need to. They're not meeting organizational goals. They're burning out employees with change fatigue. They're not being properly adopted. And perhaps most importantly, they're going way over budget. And this is what happens when they're not successful. The need to get ahead of the next big change is something that we don't always prioritize. And maybe it's because we really don't think the next change will come. But the truth is, change is inevitable. Change was abundant pre-COVID. Even then, 96% of businesses were in organizational transformations, but only 47% expected sustainable value from those change. So let's see where we're at with all this. Change management has only been successfully implemented about a third of the time in at least the last 25 to 30 years. But 96% of businesses were actively going through change even pre-COVID. And we can only assume is 100% of businesses since 2020. So I guess the next question is, does successful change management actually make much of a difference? Well, yeah. Of projects effectively applying change management, 94% meet or exceed project objectives, 81% are at or under budget, and 71% are on or ahead of schedule. That sounds pretty good, huh? Can you imagine the last time you went through an organizational change, new leadership, new technology, new processes or systems, and the change went better than expected, was on time, and cost less than you thought? But if most of our change is not having these results, where are we going wrong? Well, too often we look at change and the effect that it has on the workplace with an extremely narrow view. Most change management principles focus on the actions that make the change, focusing on the policies, the technologies, systems, tasks, structures, and boxes that we have to check. When we think of change, say the change that comes from incorporating a diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative, where many organizations focus their efforts is on creating the statements and policies around their commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. They state goals and collect data to track the progress. They revise their recruitment tools and protocols. They mandate new information and rules company-wide, and they create teams and committees to champion diversity and belonging in the workplace. But for many, many organizations, these steps are barely moving the needle. Largely, it's because these are the exact types of traditional change management approaches that we know are only successful 30 to 34% of the time. The narrow way we view incorporating change is a big part of the problem. Why we place more focus on the tasks and the processes has a lot to do with how we think about and define change management. So most organizational change management is led by, or at least heavily influenced by, three main areas: project management, technology, and accounting. And how they define change management greatly impacts how the organizational change is prioritized and implemented. In project management, change management refers to the tools and processes used to manage change within a project and its team. Now, this definition is from RECA, a leading project management company. In technology, change management is a systematic approach to dealing with the transitions of transformation of an organization's goals, processes, or technologies. Now, this is a widely cited definition in the tech sector. We copied it directly from TechTarget. And last, in accounting, organizational change management, or OCM, focuses on systems and processes used to advance change in organizations. Now, that's directly from CPA Canada. Where most organizational change happens, it's heavily influenced by accounting, technology, and project management, which prioritizes the tasks and processes. Now, these popular principles place the vast majority of their focus on the structures, policies, and tasks, the paperwork. Now, this is largely how organizational change is currently understood. The practices, policies, and procedures are what is changing. And how we understand managing change is dependent on how well these structures and tasks are implemented, which are really important, but they're rarely the full picture. The problem is that we think that the protocols and processes are the only things that change, but in reality, it's more than that. These traditional principles often miss the most important fact: the people. It's the people that have used these policies and processes that are the ones who are really changing. We mistakenly have a, if we build it, they will come attitude to change management. That's why things like the DEI example I gave earlier are often not as successful as they should be. We think that if we create goals, define the policies, and implement the tasks, then employees will gravitate to them. But most of the time, that's not the case. Our mistake is thinking that if we build these new systems and tasks, the employees will use them and they'll be more effective. So that's why we prioritize them. But where most of the real work, the real change that creates success comes from is the people accepting and implementing the new way of doing things. In fact, when the US Conference Board completed a survey, it found that a vast majority of concerns and challenges when it comes to organizational change management has almost entirely nothing to do with the policies and the paperwork. They're almost entirely about the employees' challenges, the people. This is it. This is why we can't seem to break past 35% successful implementation of organizational change in the past 25 plus years. The common people-centered approach to managing change. 69% of executives who consider their program successful offered engagement and training before and after implementation. Preparing and engaging the people is how we create a more successful implementation. If there's one thing you take away from this talk, let it be this. The evolution of change management must recognize that you will not have successful process change without getting the people on board. We need to give both of them the recognition they require. We need to align both the people and the processes in order to successfully transform and change. So we need to give each of them the attention and focus that they deserve. This involves separating them, giving both the required attention to be successful. Now, at Roman 3, we use a framework built on the psychology of change. Ultimately, it splits change management into two important and distinct roles: change guidance and project management. Now, change guidance is responsible for the people side of change. This starts at the beginning of the change process, way before any actual change takes place. And project management is responsible for the paperwork side of change. This is the center of the process where the actual changes in policies, equipments, and practices are implemented. Now, a lot of people will say that they've heard or used terms like change agent or change champion before. These are typically used to describe the person who's leading the change, but really they're just synonyms for change management. What we are talking about is that change management requires two clear and distinct skill sets. A single change agent is not where success is going to come from. This is the old way. You need a person who can handle and guide the people through the change, and a person who can manage the project side, the processes, the paperwork. They need to work together, but intentionally focus their efforts in distinct areas. This allows the focus from leadership to be more targeted and intentional. You need to be as committed to guiding the people through the change as you are to successfully incorporating the new policies or technologies or practices. The big difference is that change guidance needs to start well before the project management happens, and it needs to be a continued focus throughout the entire process. So this is change management evolved. Most of this new approach is focused on ensuring that there's as much support for the people as there is for the process. Largely, the project management steps listed is how we currently approach change management using the PMI principles. Where the evolution of change management comes from is recognizing that change is not just a process to manage, that people are critical to the success of the project. So to get past the 34% successful implementation, Organizations need to be as committed to change guidance as they already are to project management. So let's dig into what change guidance is. Now, first, the change guide needs to create buy-in. This is about communicating the coming change, listening and addressing concerns, making the value of change clear and practical, and speak to the different needs of different audiences. When creating buy-in for change, you need to move people past the reluctance and get them to the point where they understand that old equals fine, but new equals better. This is a lot of communication activities using logical and emotional evidence to generate support for the new reality that is coming. We call this stage changing minds. Now, next, the change guide needs to create acceptance. This is about adopting the required way of thinking. It's about starting to retrain habits and comfort zones and acknowledging the learning curve. Recognize and support the frustrating learning stage. This is about creating acceptance of both the new way of thinking that will be required to implement the new reality and to accept the messy, uncomfortable nature that will come from the transition. We call this stage changing thinking. Now, then the change guide needs to work with the project management, okay? So this is about the project manager preparing the paperwork, the policies, the technology, that part of the change. They prepare the actions of the change in the administrative processes that are visible and critical to the change actually taking place. And the change guide needs to support the new policies, provide feedback to the project manager, continue to listen to staff as they get used to the change, and keep their finger on the pulse of the organization. The change guide stays focused on the people, maintaining communications to help speed up the adoption of the new policies and processes. We call this stage changing actions. So then, while the project manager is identifying the practical key performance indicators, the KPIs of success for the new reality, creating the benchmarks and signs of success that will come from fully understanding and accepting the elements that have been changed, the change guide needs to create clarity, maintain the communications, ensure the full vision is being realized, address lingering worries or anxieties, and tell the story of staff's journey through the process. The change guidance needs to carry through the stage to ensure buy-in for the new measurements of success. It's also important to communicate the success that has come from this change. So we call this last stage changing the measurements of success. And here's a simple visual representation of how these two approaches work in tandem. The change guide starts before the plan takes effect, changing minds. Then while the project manager, using the KPI principles, starts the initiation and plan stages of the change guide is keeping communications with staff and getting them used to the changing how they think about the new methods, alleviating concerns, accepting this messy learning curve that they have to come. Then the change guide and project manager work together to ensure that the new processes and tasks and changes and actions to allow people to stay engaged while they work through the new way of doing things. Monitoring the implementation and making the required adjustments to the processes and communications to staff. Then while the implementation winds down and the new way is becoming accepted, the change guide ensures that the new expectations and measurements of success are understood and carried through. This is the evolution of change management. Now, let's see how this all comes together by looking at an example. So one of the biggest organizational transformations is a merger, two distinct entities needing to become one. When this happens, everything gets changed. Nothing really ever stays the same. All kinds of stress and anxiety is experienced and justified. So we're going to take a look at an example of a big stressful change in the form of two towns amalgamating. This is a story about a relatively simple project that we had that became a large and complex endeavor. We've obviously changed some of the specifics to protect confidentiality. So let's meet the towns. First is Quaintsberg. Quaintsberg is a tourist town full of artisan restaurants, cottage-style homes, and many annual festivals. They have a lost-in-time aesthetic and are about the traditional ways. This also means the municipal government is less technologically advanced and still does things old school. Now, Quaintsberg shares a border with a similar town. That town is called Modernville. Modernville is a commercial center with a large industrial park, lots of office buildings, and trendy modern cafes and restaurants. They have a corporate office appeal and are about technological conveniences and assets. This also means their municipal government is about staying current and being progressive. So let's meet the teams. First is the Quaintsberg teams. So let's meet Brian. Brian is the CAO of Quaintsberg. Brian has been the CAO for over 15 years, and he and his management team have been together for over a decade. The Quaintsberg staff have about 60 employees and have been committed to making the town appeal to its senior residents and providing an amazing tourism experience. So now, the Modernville team. Let's meet Gwen. So Gwen was the CAO of Modernville. She was hired 3 years ago, and most of her management team have been in their role for less than 5 years. The Modernville staff have about 85 employees and have been committed to making the town appeal to younger residents and providing a pleasurable place to live and work. Now, we were hired by both towns. They would regularly participate in collaborative procurement to save costs. So we were hired to explore their HR needs for expanding their economic development. Very early on in our contract, the councils of both towns decided to amalgamate into one large town to leverage their size, lower the cost of public services, and to access more government funding. Obviously, our role with the towns had changed, and our organizational change management experience was utilized. We already had a seat at the table of both management teams, so even though our support was limited to an advisory role, we were thrown into the thick of it. Now, the towns were provided an amalgamation manager to lead the transition and make the processes as smooth as they could be. However, it became clear that the amalgamation manager was far more focused on the processes than the people. The amalgamation manager was a former CAO of a large municipality and a highly experienced CPA. Now, when the towns merged, there was tons of financial and legal standards, safeguards, and protocols. So a CPA was actually a very logical choice for an amalgamation manager. But as you mentioned earlier, how someone defines change management has a lot of impact on how they prioritize it. So to get the project going, the amalgamation manager also brought in a legal firm, a small tech company, and was provided a provincial government employee to be the project lead for the more admin-heavy areas. And to be perfectly honest, things started off pretty rough. So right out of the gate, the timeline was created for the change, and it was aggressive. The decisions of two councils was a bit of a shock. They had each talked about amalgamating for years with no action, but all of a sudden, the ability to access extensive government funding made it something that they quickly turned into a reality. Right out of the gate, many of the communications from the amalgamation manager was entirely about municipal bylaws, the accounts and liabilities, and the buildings and assets. There was nothing provided to staff that would generate support. It was very much a, this is happening, so you need to get on board kind of mentality. Now, staff were told that the efforts would be made to keep everyone employed, but that was about the only thing they really ever heard. There was little acknowledgement for the extra work staff were going to be required to do in order to keep both towns running day to day and prepare for the coming amalgamation. This was a bit of a whirlwind, but it didn't take long for staff to come to us because we had developed relationships to our other projects and they wanted to know what we knew about how the new jobs would play out. And honestly, they just wanted to vent to us. So this was when we felt we had to step in and make the staff's concerns known. Now, really, we were overstepping. We were not part of the amalgamation team officially. We were just in a unique situation to have access and, more importantly, the trust of the staff and leadership of both organizations. So we had a lot of rather direct and frank conversations with both Brian and Gwen. We told them that the team that they were being provided was doing an excellent job with the policies, protocols, and procedures, but they were completely forgetting about the people. The amalgamation team was going to get the building ready, the departments organized, and the bylaws and processes in place, but they were not getting the staff or residents on board. Basically, the building would be ready, but if something didn't change fast, there would be no one left to fill it. The project management was taken care of, but there was no change guidance. We told the CAOs that they needed to be the change guides, that they had to place their main focus on the people and let the project managers place their focus on the paper. The problem was they were already way behind. Change guidance is most effective when it starts well before the actual change is happening, ideally before it's even publicly announced. So we told Gwen and Brian that they needed to get ahead of the story. Staff did not know what was happening, and with a lack of official communications, everyone's panicked brains were going to worst case scenarios. So fortunately, both towns had great communication teams. We advised both towns to go hard on the external and the internal communications, which meant that they needed to constantly stay up to date with the amalgamation team and translate what was happening to all the stakeholders. But just relaying information, saying what's happening right now isn't good enough. They needed to speak to the concerns of the audience with more accurate information. Generating buy-in had to become the #1 priority. One of the most common oversights with communications when change happens is the tendency to just make the information available somewhere. Go here and look for it. Now, making information available is a good habit to be in, but once the stress and anxiety starts, people don't have the mental bandwidth to find the most relevant information among a sea of documents or a wall of text. There needs to be someone who can put the information into context. You need to craft communication strategies for each unique audience and speak to their specific concerns to help them buy into that need for change. In this case, we needed to have a communication strategy that would be equal in content, but targeted in language for each of the towns. As you can see, the towns were pretty different. So one generic message would not be effective. We also needed to communicate to the residents to get their buy-in. Because just like when a corporate merger happens, you need to address the concerns of your customers. Everyone's always worried about costs increasing. So that, among other things, needed to be addressed before a rumor started. Once you identify your audience, you need to make sure that you're clearly explaining how the change will impact them. This means clearly explaining how they will benefit and address any concerns that they may have. When it comes to the Quaintsberg staff, the communication for buy-in was mainly around how the new systems would bring a more productive approach to work, allow them to more easily meet the needs of their longtime residents. With the Modernville staff, it was about having greater assets and resources to expand the appeal of the town and its residents. With the residents of both towns, it was about addressing taxes by explaining that the intention is to increase services while actually reducing costs. So once staff started to feel like they understood why all this was happening and that they would individually benefit, it made the extra effort seem more worth it. Now, I make it seem like there was a single flyer and everybody was happy. That was definitely not the case. With the staff, it took a bunch of team meetings, a few different attempts to get the value of the amalgamation out of the way that effectively spoke to the audience, and a lot of staff getting angry and stressed along the way. But that's to be expected. But this is why changing minds, the first stage of a change management evolve approach, is supposed to happen before the change starts. Get the communication and buy-in out before people are negatively impacted. Avoid a lot of the stress and panic. Not starting changing minds approach before the change is a lot of bailing out of a leaky boat. You just need to hope that you can stay ahead of it enough that it doesn't sink you. But that being said, once folks were willing to see the value in the change, Then we had to deal with the change itself. Now, you need to retrain people to the new way of doing things and make allowance for the challenging learning phase. So once they started combining the departments, along with the programs, assets, and procedures and technologies, there was a lot of discomfort. Brian and Gwen went out of their way to make it clear to staff that this was going to be challenging, stressful, and annoying. And they were going to have issues, make mistakes, and get frustrated, but that was okay. And the awkward learning phase was going to be expected. And they were right. They had a lot of stressed out and frustrated staff come and see them. But the difference was now the staff felt like they could talk about the problems they were having with Brian and Gwen. They knew it was normal to have challenges and that it was okay to ask for help. Before our intervention, the challenges and frustrations were framed as an us versus them problem between the two towns. The Modernville staff thought those old fogies over in Quaintsville were just stuck in their outdated ways. And the Quaintsberg staff thought those pretentious Modernville staff were just trying to make everything so much more complicated than it needed to be. Now, I can't say that completely stopped, but there was more acceptance of the learning stages that was challenging for everyone, and they all had to be patient. And this did make the learning curve a bit easier to get through. Now, the work the amalgamation team had been doing was now finally becoming adopted and successful. Once the staff understood the value of the amalgamation and had bought in enough to not resist the change, and once they felt they were heard by the CAOs and their concerns were addressed, and once they started to accept this awkward transition and the annoying learning curve, then they started to retrain their thinking to accept and use the new processes and policies. Like the Quaintsberg staff stopped fighting the increased use of technology to streamline their systems. A simple thing like letting residents pay their water bills online, which completely fixed the normal problems they were having with a crazy week at the end of every month, while residents had to rush in to pay their balance. They started to actually see that these new processes were for the better. Once they changed their minds and changed their thinking, the change in action was so much easier. Once the people change finally caught up to the process change, things really started to come together. This allowed the CAOs to have a much more rounded view of the new changes and processes. Seeing the change from the eyes of their staff gave Brian and Gwen the new perspective and knowledge of this new way of doing things that they never would have seen otherwise. Now, once things started to move forward at the end of this amalgamation process and the plans for the new large town were being made, concerns started up again. Everybody was so excited to finally see the light at the end of the tunnel, but they were exhausted from all they had to go through so far, and they almost forgot about the last stage of change management. They still needed to change the way they measured and defined success. There is no point in making organizational change if you only measure success based on how you used to do things. How the Quaintsberg staff had measured their customer service team's performance, for example, was in the old way, they measured success by the number of residents that they serve per month. But this wasn't going to work anymore. Before the amalgamation, if someone needed something, they would call the frontline team who would just do it all for them right over the phone, and they would track that stat. But with the new automated processes and services, residents could do so much more self-service online, like the water bill. So care needed to be made to address the productivity using different metrics. So instead, the frontline team started to do reach outs, customer services, or reach out services, and do public meetings to educate residents on all the new things the system could provide. And that was how they tracked success and productivity that way. But eventually, despite the rocky start and the unavoidable stress and mistakes along the way, the change was successful. So the new town was called Delightdale, and it was in a good position to carve out its new destiny now that everybody was looking in the same direction. But the truth is, change and transformation are messy. It's stressful, it's frustrating, it's worrisome, and at times it's really chaotic. But if you have a good reason to do it, and you go through the steps of changing minds, changing thinking, changing actions, and changing the measurements of success with the support of a change guide, you can mitigate a lot of the resistance and anxiety to allow for greater adoption and the acceptance from those involved. So let's give a quick recap. So with changing minds, we had to create buy-in to prepare and train people for what was coming. With changing thinking, we had to get the people to accept the benefits and new approaches, as well as normalize the messy learning process. With changing actions, we needed to support people to maintain strong communications as they got used to the new reality. And with changing the measurements of success, we needed to make sure what success looked like was reflective of the new way of doing things. Now, I just shared with you a rather long story of how we use this process in a very large and complex situation. However, this approach works for any change, large and small. The details are different, but the roles and stages stay the same. So let's look at how this works from a high level with a smaller example of organizational change, a change in leadership. So a new CEO, managing partner, or executive director can bring the same change management struggles, especially when that new leader is hired to shake things up, modernize, or lead the organization into a new direction. But in this situation, the roles and stages are the same. What it looks like when we support a new change leadership transition is always a little bit different. Sometimes we will act as the change guides and support the staff with the direction of the new leadership that they want to go in. Sometimes we will support the executive team to be the change guides for their departments. And sometimes the new leaders will fulfill that role. The key is to have someone filling both responsibilities, change guide and project management. But we need to follow the steps. We often advise the new leader and the communications team to work together to start creating buy-in at the beginning while things are relatively still the same. Then we make sure that everyone knows that the transition is challenging and that mistakes and frustrations are par for the course. It's important, especially when there's a technical or mission and value related change, that training is always provided. We've often provided support and training on organizational culture or improved employee recognition and communications during or after a large change in management or a large change in leadership. Then we have to ensure the communications and support are still in place and people feel safe to share their concerns once they are in the thick of the new processes. And then we have to ensure that the leadership's new expectations are clearly articulated and what success looks like is very well understood. Now, sometimes this can happen with a change in technology, with something smaller but transformational, like a new CRM or employee management system or an e-commerce platform. The stages of support are still required. Typically, the IT department will act as project managers, and often HR will be the change guides. But before you get the new system, you have to create buy-in for how it will make people's jobs better or easier, and people need to be ready and willing to use it. Then you have to prepare for the learning curve. Let people get used to it. When possible, create a certain level of proficiency or comfort before you actually launch it to full use. Then, once you're fully ready to launch, continue the support, continue the patience. The project managers will get it out and functioning, and the change guides will stay focused on the people, advocating for those who are still having issues and giving people what they need to become comfortable with it. Then once it's in full use, make sure everyone knows what success looks like, promote how it is helping, and make sure that it is included into the organizational and individual KPIs. Make what success looks like with it very clear. Now more than ever, we can't let only 30% of change initiatives be successful. We need to dedicate the time and resources and efforts to do it right. This involves having the right skills and knowing the right steps. Having a clear plan and knowing how to get started are essential. If you would like some help getting ready for the next change, or to make sure you're prepared for the one you're already in, then the best thing that you can do is to book a free, no obligation 30-minute consultation with us. If you are responsible or involved in leading your team through a change, we can help by providing a clear plan on how to get the most out of your current efforts by leveraging Change Management Evolved. If you're an HR professional looking to bring more intention or support to the people's side of change, we can help you embody the role of the change guides. If you're an owner or executive who is now or will sometime soon be going through a change, or if you're in the unfortunate situation where you have gone through a change without these clear steps, you're going to want to book a consultation. Now, our chat with you is a no pressure, no commitment required conversation. The consultation is our chance to find out your specific needs so we can provide you with the best advice to get you started. Now, as James said, we are so confident their expertise and strategies can lead to the change you are looking for that we even offer a satisfaction guarantee. Now, James will share a link so you can book your free consultation so that way you won't miss out. Now, that's pretty much all I have to say. So thank you all, and I hope something in our talk today will change how you think about change. Thanks. James?